Okay, everyone, we're going to not have my little face in the corner, partly because it cuts off part of the PowerPoint slide, mostly because it makes the file, I think, so much bigger. And this is the second time I'm recording this because the first time I did it with video, it crashed. So I'm doing this again. My frustrations notwithstanding, welcome to the Metaphysical Poets. This time we're going to look at critical perspectives on the female and feminine in metaphysical poetry. We're going to start with a biblical quotation from the New Testament, the first book of Timothy. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. Now, I'm not putting this as the epigraph to the presentation because I believe it. I just wanted to frame some of the ideas that we're going to look at today within the perspective of the Bible, because as you'll know, in this time period, it was still very much the number one manual for moral conduct and good behaviour. So we're going to be looking today at female and feminine in metaphysical poetry. We'll start off by looking at some historical context before diving into a critical perspective. We're going to talk you through an essay by Jan de Bruyne, which is about the ideal lady and the rise of feminism in the 17th century. And it's a fascinating essay, and I'm going to share the key points with you. And if I can share the whole essay with you, I will. I'm not quite sure I'm going to extract it from JSON yet, but we'll have a go. Then we're going to look at three poets. Each poet is going to have a poem that deals with female or femininity in some way. So we've got Thomas Carey, not Carew. Carey is spelled Carew, but it's pronounced Carey. And Bradstreet and Catherine Phillips, before looking at some conclusions. And to help us draw conclusions and keep us focused on the way, our chief aim is to explore the ways in which women were treated and depicted in the 17th century and its literature. And our big question is, because we're looking at metaphysical poetry, does metaphysical poetry modernize the cause of female equality, or does it hinder it? We know that metaphysical poetry is very useful for showing off a poet's intelligence and wit, for structuring an argument, for entertainment, and for the sheer beauty of an extended image or a conceit. But is it a decent political tool? We looked at Marvell last week, and Marvell's version of womanhood is one to receive, repeated urge and argument. Same with Duns of Flea. Is there more to this poetry, or is it just frivolous? Is it just playful, or is it something that's a bit more substantial? So, bit of historical context. Let's frame it this way: women were still legally the property of their fathers until they were married. We know this to be true. But if we just cling to that, that's not all there is to it, not by a long shot. Actually, what I want to do is go a bit further back to the 16th century, the Tudor era. And I want to tell you that given the era, the role of women was relatively unconstrained, given what we would expect of this era. Spaniards and Italians visited England frequently during this period, and they commented, often quite disparagingly, on how free women were in England. And this is mostly because women were educated more than their international European counterparts were. Alongside this, women started to play a significant role in medical care, and this really expanded into the 17th century. So women went into the nursing profession in a big way, as we still see today. They formed and ran nursing homes for the old, the sick, the infirm. They ran lunatic asylums. This wasn't fully supported by the medical men of the day, but then such things never are. Really interestingly, I presumed that in this time period, most English women married frighteningly young, touch the Romeo and Juliet's about us. But actually over 90% of English women entered marriage at an average age of 25, 26, which is very, very modern. It was younger for the nobility and gentry, but we're still talking late teens, early 20s. And in fact, many city or townswomen delayed marriage until their 30s or 40s because they had younger siblings. If you think about it, you've got a massive family, women used to pump out children at quite an alarming rate, like some sort of birth cannon. You think about it, you could be in your 20s and still have a very young set of siblings. with whom you needed to help out at home, so everyone else could get themselves to work and earn that money, so they didn't die. Interestingly as well, a fourth of English brides were pregnant at their weddings, showing that there was a big disparity between what you were supposed to do in the bedroom and what you actually did. And actually there's perhaps a lot more sexual freedom than we'd be led to believe. There's a dark side though, and it comes in the form of witchcraft. Henry VII passed his Witchcraft Act in 1542, which was a bit of a soft act, really. You know, you weren't allowed to be a witch, which is bad, etc. So far, so superstitious. But it was made a felony in 1603 by James I, who absolutely hated witches because he hated women. And you only have to look as far as his book Demonology, influenced itself by the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in which he talks about the inferiority of the female sex and how susceptible they are to the snares of the devil. More on that later. James I's attitudes were widely mocked post 1700. It seems to suggest that there's a shift in attitudes towards women. After 1700, it was actually illegal to pretend to be a witch because it was believed to be such nonsense that people could be witches. But you've got to bear in mind that by 1700 we're dealing with the Enlightenment and the age of reason and scientific rationality and the birth of physics, thanks to Isaac Newton and Hooke and that sort of thing. So we are looking perhaps then, and this is one of the things we're going to explore, we are perhaps looking at a tipping point in terms of how women were presented. And we use literature almost as historical evidence to see if that was the case. Let's look at Jane de Bruyne. So she starts off by talking about John Ford, eminent dramatist of the time, and she talks about how he describes women. And he describes women, as highlighted here for you in the first extract, as nature's pride, virtue's ornaments, angels on earth, worthy to be served, saints in heaven, memorable to be registered. It's very nice, isn't it? You'll notice we've got angels and saints. So we've got this very courtly tradition of male-female love. Now, courtly love at this point had been around for a while, since the Middle Ages. You know, if you think about Arthurian romance and chivalry and the way knights were supposed to behave, and indeed you think about Romeo's treatment of Juliet, the idea that a woman was placed upon this pedestal, she was flattered, showered with compliments, likened to heavenly beings, completely deified and not viewed in any way that was realistic, and her favour had to be won. Now, when a woman's favour wasn't won, that's where we get Petrarch's interminable whinging about being rejected. And so there is an overlap between that Petrarchan foppery and the desire of courtly love. But courtly love is on its way out. I mean, it's been around for a while. And so therefore, De Bruyne says that John Ford actually is representing a version of male-female relations and the presentation of women that's actually being quite outmoded. And actually, quite humorously, but also quite sadly at the same time, in Honor Triumphant, there's a little annotation, a contemporary annotation of somebody who's read it. They've scribbled in the margin, and it's down here. Ford can afford much flattering praise to women, which they cannot afford for to perform. Perfidious are they, much and most untrue to men, far gone in ill and never to return. Basically, it's all royal and good, Ford saying that women are great and they're beautiful and stuff, but he's saying they can't live up to it. They're perfidious, they're untrue, they're unfaithful, they're untrustworthy, and they're far gone in ill, never to return. They are far gone in sin, and they're never coming back from that. They are destined for hell. Women's fickle mind is more light than feather, dust, or wind wind, as we pronounce it now. And it says most damningly of all, that woman is a needful evil. So woman is evil, so why do we keep them around? Because we need them. Because we need them to procreate, and presumably somebody's got to put dinner on. So we've got the old-fashioned courtly view being taken down in real time in a scribbled angry annotation, no less. which seems to suggest that in the 17th century, things weren't looking very good for women. And it only gets worse when we delve into it. Let's look at let's look at an Italian. So this is ascribed to Benvenuto Italian. We don't know his real name. Wrote The Passenger. He was an Italian traveller. Travelled around Europe, and this is the section he wrote on England, and he addresses it to the English gentleman, and he comments on how English gentlemen should be treating their women in case they weren't aware. And he says, "Observe, my English gentlemen, that blows have a wonderful prerogative in the feminine sex." Blows meaning punches, hits. So he says that blows are very useful for when you're dealing with women. It's a really good idea to hit them. Why is that then, Benvenuto? For if she be a bad woman, there is no more proper plaster to mend them than this. The best way to fix them if she's bad. And she usually is, in this view. And it's therefore the best way to reduce her to perfection. No, reduce her, to break her down. It's not about building her up, it's about breaking her down. All right. And this is a recurrent theme, the idea that women need to be broken down. And there's no quicker way to break something than with your fists. It didn't help that there was royal support and assent to these very anti-female, anti-woman views. In James I's Demonology, he writes that sex, the female sex, is frailer, weaker than man is. So it is easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the devil. So basically, if the devil's going to get to a man, he's going to do it for a woman. So watch out, women. It didn't help that James I vastly preferred the company of men to women, with all of that implies. And therefore, what a woman should be, because we've got lots and lots about what she shouldn't be, but what she should be, according to Nicholas Breton, she is the eye of wariness, being careful. She's got to be careful. She's got to keep the eye out. The tongue of silence, as in no tongue. The hand of labour, do all the work. And the heart of love. But you'll note that this is about the domestic sphere. Stay at home, behave yourself, be quiet, do all the work. And it does get worse. Braithwaite says that women should be seen and not heard. He says, be as one who understandeth. Act like you understand, yet hold thy tongue. Don't speak. This idea of women being silent seems very, very important to men at the time. And he goes on to say in The English Gentlewoman Drawn Out to the Full Body, he says that women shouldn't bother with being beautiful, shouldn't bother dressing themselves up, shouldn't bother being concerned with going out and dancing and looking pretty, mostly because their beauty is temporal. When they die, worms will eat their corpse, and then you won't look very pretty, will you? Braithwaite says. Surely he didn't apply the same to all of those men at the time who wanted to make themselves look really nice, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. And so therefore, if women were going to be seen and not heard, and if they were going to know how to behave themselves, and if they were going to be kept domestic, then there were certain ideal programs for virgins, i.e. young women who may or may not have actually been virgins. Virgin here just seems to be shorthand for a woman who's supposed to be a virgin. They should be learning reading, writing, needlework, languages, music, economy, and household management. Music was particularly desired because it pleased the husband, and languages just made her look classy, which is what you wanted with a woman. You wanted one that spoke French. And therefore, women needed to be well trained. And the idea is that women were perverse and they were susceptible to evil. So if you kept them busy and kept them trained, this is not too dissimilar to the phrase, the devil makes works for idle hands. If women are idle, they're going to be doing all sorts of naughty things. But there's hope. And Brian points out that actually, by the time we get to the middle of the century, so we're looking at 1650-ish, we start to see women being viewed in a way that's not a male plaything anymore. At this time, a guy called Edward Fleetwood translated a work of Henry Cornelius Agrippa, and he reverses the main argument for keeping women in their place. Now, it all goes back to Eve in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Eve was considered for years and years and years to be to blame for the fall of mankind and original sin. Now, I just want to remind you what original sin is and why it's such a big idea and why it's such a big deal. Original sin is the Christian belief. It's definitely believed in Catholicism and a bunch of the other Christian denominations as well, I believe. There may well be some who don't believe in it. But it's the belief that because mankind, and in this case, read women, sinned against God by eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. It's always a something of something in the Bible, isn't it? Therefore, the stain of that sin has been inherited, almost like a really horrible gene, and is inherited by every mortal man and woman to this day. And you remember, this is why Jesus Christ had to be crucified. If you're confused about this, see my last video. And the thing is, this would all be fine, I suppose. It's weird anyway, but it would be fine if man and woman had been blamed equally, but they weren't. It was believed that Eve was to blame, and by the look, it's because Eve was the one who was tempted by the serpent, who's the proxy for the devil, and it's Eve who suggests to Adam that they eat the apple. And since then, women were painted as being untrustworthy, seductive, and thoroughly capable of very naughty things, and presumably also quite fond of the odd fruit. And yet, Fleetwood / Agrippa twist it, and he says the man was forbid to eat of the fruit of the tree. God didn't say anything to the woman because the woman wasn't even created, and actually he's right. So what happens in Genesis is God creates, well, he says light first, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to see what he's doing. So he says, let there be light, and there was light, and God was like, that's brilliant, but there's nothing here now, and I can really see that there's nothing here, so I better put stuff here, otherwise it's just a really bright, empty void. And so, God knows what he was doing before that. Well, I suppose God does know. But so he created man, as in Adam, literally created man, and plonked Adam down in the middle of the garden and went, hello. Adam went, hi, how you doing? Oh, am I? Well, you're Adam. I'm man. Oh, am I? Okay. Good. Showed him around the garden. Adam went, this is very nice, actually. This is really, really nice. And God went, thanks very much. Well, it took me a day. And Adam goes, well, it looks like it took much longer. And God says, thank you very much. And Adam's pottering around the garden, as you do. And God comes down and says, how is it going? Do you like the garden? I mean, you know, you're my best creation. I created you in my image, so you're welcome. So presume it's all fine. I am God after all, so presumably I can only create something perfect. And when it is good, I am bored. I am on my own. I'm very much talking to birds that can't respond to me. So what are you gonna do? And God goes, all right, fine. Give me a rib. What? Well, I'm gonna take a rib, and I'm going to create you a friend. Oh, okay. Creates him Eve. But between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve, that's when God tells Adam not to eat the fruit. There's no record in Genesis of Eve being told not to eat the fruit. Now, presumably, Adam and Eve could have had a chat about it. You know, don't go to that tree, but it's a big garden. And besides, it's a myth. But the point is it was a myth that was believed literally, and so it was literally believed that it was all Eve's fault. And yet, Fleetwood proves that actually, if we're going to take it literally, it's Adam's fault, right? Because Adam should have said to Eve, as soon as she got that fruit out, should have slapped out her hand and said, no, God said don't eat that. I know you didn't know because you weren't here for orientation. But anyway, so he flips that round, which is great. And he also goes on to say that there are loads of women famous in the worlds of letters and learning. And he says that therefore they're just as capable of intellectual pursuits and they're just as smart. He said, but men keep stifling women's education, so no wonder they're not as educated. And he said, actually, I reckon there are women that are smarter than men, right? Shock, right? But they have another chance to be so. So now we're cooking. And now we're getting on to Mary Astell, who is brilliant. All right, Mary Astell comes in the mid 1600s, so mid 17th century. Don't get those two mixed up. And she absolutely trounces any arguments against female education, and she believes that female education is what unlocks female potential, and she's right. And she's right. Universally, education is what unlocks the potential of a human being. And she actually has this wonderfully pithy bit where she says that man may well talk about how he's superior, how he's got these wonderful abilities, and he might look at women and go, oh, how inferior you are. But she said, are we not forgetting how many mistakes men make? It's all the time. you know, whereas women are much more fair, much more gentle, you know, we don't make anywhere near as many mistakes. Maybe we should have a bit of a go, you know. And she said, look at us. There's no reason, you know, if we both have the same opportunities, why we shouldn't equally operate. You know, it's not our fault that we've been given the short end of the stick. And she argues incredibly well. And she says that all the shortcomings that women may have are because of men. And she's saying men are stupid, right? Because we could have had really smart women, all right? But men were too stupid to allow that, all right? So they've made women stupid through their stupidity. The only way that women are going to get smarter is if they're educated, right? And that is going to secure women's progress. Dead on. De Bruyne strikes a bit of a sad note towards the end of her essay. She says that despite Astor's protestations and despite the winds of change beginning to shift, there wasn't any widespread reform. And so she said that Mary Astor adopted an escapist attitude. She suggests in a serious proposal that ladies might go and live in religious retirement, as in so separate from the rest of society. So women should just leave society. And that there they should search for knowledge and secure their future in heaven. But De Bruyne notes that actually this might have been a very, very clever bit of argument by Mary Astor, because if you think about this scenario, I'll just explain this for you. So let's say hypothetically, all the women in society say, "Men, do you know what? You're right. Do you know what? We are a burden. You know, we are pretty bad. You've been telling us we're bad for ages. You know, we're easily seduced. You know, we're not going to make it to heaven. We're pretty bad. Why don't we just, we'll take ourselves off your hands. We'll go and live on our own, all right? And we'll just separate society and you'll be done with us. You know, you don't have to worry about us anymore." But of course, men wouldn't want that, would they? Men would do everything in his power to prevent the exodus of women. And as soon as a man does that, he proves that women are useful. Boom. Game, set, and match to Mary Astor. So now we're going to look at the poems and the poets. Each time I'm going to introduce the poet somewhat biographically, sometimes also while introducing some concepts that I'll dip into. I'll try to keep it so it's not too rambly. Then I'm going to, in light of what we know about that poet, we'll look at a poem, and then we're going to apply that to our big question. We're going to look at whether the metaphysical poetry we're looking at actually helps the cause of female equality, or whether it hinders it. What does it represent? Is it Mary Astor, or is it all of those blokes at the start who thought women were terrible? We're going to start with our only male poet of today. We're going to have a male poet and two lady poets. We're going to start with Thomas Carey, not Carew. Don't say Carew. It's illegal. I'm going to start off actually with a little story. It's an apocryphal story. I mean, it's probably not true, but that kind of sums up what kind of bloke Thomas Carey was. Now, he was working at court. He was a courtier, and he was working for Charles I, and he was bringing Charles I into the Queen's bedchamber one night by candlelight, and as he's going into the Queen's room, he sees that the Lord St Albans is already in the Queen's room, and he's got his arms around the Queen, which looks terrible, and so he stumbles and extinguishes the candle, making it like an accident, so Lord St Albans can beat a hasty retreat, and the Queen doesn't look like she's been doing the naughty with one of the other courtiers. And the king didn't see it. I don't know how, but the king didn't see it. And the Queen heaped favours on the poet. And this does kind of sum up, even if it's not true, and it probably isn't, this kind of sums up Carey, though. He was a smart guy. He was an innovator. And he was a man who wasn't afraid of using his initiative. The stand-up bloke. Now, poetically speaking, he sits somewhere between the Cavalier poets and the metaphysical poets. His poetry contains elements of both. He was a Cavalier. He supported Charles I. He was a courtier. His poetic oeuvre is mostly comprised of sensuous lyrics, and by sensuous lyrics I mean poems about about love, about the human body, about sex, but also just about feeling, about the sensitive aspects of the self. Um, and he called it a mine of rich and pregnant fancy, and by pregnant, full of fanciful ideas. And this is kind of what makes him metaphysical, really. Um, Many of his lyrics were addressed to a woman called Celia. We don't know who she was, but she was probably his long-term lover. And there's lots and lots of carpe diem urging in his poems, like we see with Marvell, and also like we see pretty much all of the Cavaliers at some point. So there's your Cavalier link. And his poems are short, which is another Cavalier thing, and sometimes overtly sexual as well. Again, another Cavalier thing. So we've got him right in the middle of these two. Massively influenced by John Donne. John Donne had really risen in terms of his influence, and he was court preacher to Charles I at the time. And Donne influenced a great influence over Crewe. We've got to remember that Donne was another incredibly clever guy. And again, another poet who really deals with sensuousness and sexuality. And you see a real similarity between the imagery of Carey and the imagery of Donne, though Carey's poems are much more lucid and direct than Donne's, whereas Donne's are much more fanciful, much more ornate, much more baroque. And he was really, really smart. He went to university early. He was well liked in his time, and he was described, I think, by Ben Jonson as a person of pleasant and facetious wit. He was a guy who wasn't afraid to be sarcastic. He was wry, witty, pithy, he was clever. So let's see whether those qualities make it into his poetry. Now, so we're going to look at this poem mostly in terms of whether or not it modernizes or hinders the cause of female equality. So it's called To a Lady That Desired I Would Love Her. All right, let's go to this. Now you have freely given me leave to love, what will you do? Shall I your mirth or passion move when I begin to woo? Will you torment or scorn or love me too? Each petty beauty can disdain, and I spite of your hate. Without your leave can see and die, dispense a nobler fate. 'Tis easy to destroy you may create. Then give me leave to love, and love me too, not with design, to raise as love's cursed rebels do, when puling poets whine. Fame to their beauty from their beloved eyne, grief is a puddle, reflects not clear your beauty's rays. Joys are pure streams, your eyes appear, sullen in sadder lays. In cheerful numbers they shine bright with praise. Which shall not mention to express you fair. Wounds, flames, and darts, storms in your brow, nets in your hair, suborning all your parts, or to betray, or torture captive hearts. I'll make your eyes like morning suns appear, as mild and fair. Your brow is crystal smooth and clear, and your dishevelled hair shall flow like a calm region of the air. Okay, so it's an apostrophe. It's addressed to an unspeaking person, in this case, and again, another lady, exactly like Marvell. But it doesn't have Marvell's playfulness, at least not overtly. It's not really a ludic poem. And actually, when we get into it, it's the opposite, actually. It comes across as quite small, quite petty, and quite spiteful. So we start off then, we've got these rhetorical questions at the start. They're not triadic at all, actually. I don't know why I put triadic, but they're rhetorical questions. Will you torment us? Oh, I see, yes. Torment or scorn or love me too. And so the poem starts very interrogatively. It starts off as an apostrophe, but demanding immediate response. Whereas with Marvell, it gives the woman a lot more space. I argued that Marvell's poem wasn't sexist last time, and but here it's different. It's much more aggressive. And if we look at the tricolon as well, will you torment or scorn or love me too? This is tricolon in the classical sense, in that we've got the rule of three but the first two are semantically linked. So torment and scorn are both to do with, they're both verbs to do with doing horrible things to someone, but love is antonymic, it's the opposite. And that's how tricolon classically works, or at least when it works best, is you've got two things that go together and then you've got a switch where the third one is surprising. It subverts it, which would be ludic, except the whole thing comes across as a bit despairing. So will you torment me? Will you torture me? Will you treat me badly, scorn me, or love me too? And so there's a real sense of jarring uncertainty about that tricolon. And it makes the question more pertinent and more pressing because it gives her the binary options. The thing is it's not fully binary because it's a 2-1 split in nastiness's favour. Torment and scorn versus love, 2-1. And so that sets up the poem. And the title leads you to believe that the poem is going to be different. To a lady that desired I would love her implies that the poem is going to be a response to a woman who has said, I want you to love me, and it's going to be the man deciding whether he does or not. But the poem's the other way round. Now you have freely given me leave to love. So now you have allowed me to love. Now what are you going to do? Now, what leave to love means? I mean, leave means permission, and we will see that it comes up later on. So give somebody leave means to give them permission, give them your blessing. But it's unclear as to how she's done that. It seems that just by allowing his opening advances, perhaps he's trying to court her in this courtly love fashion that's being outmoded. Maybe the poem works as a criticism of that. Maybe the poem is saying that if men try to woo women in that traditional way by showering them with ridiculous epithets and blazoning them, maybe you're not going to get anywhere. Maybe it's criticism of that. The second stanza begins with a bit of a takedown about beauty, and it seems to mimic one of the quotations we looked at earlier, the idea that beauty isn't something that women should spend their time on. Each petty beauty can disdain, and I spite of your hate. Basically, he's saying that women who are beautiful are petty, and beauty allows you to look down on people. Each petty beauty can say, and he's saying because you consider yourself so beautiful, you act like you're so much better than me, but you're not. You're petty. And he says, I spite of your hate. Now this is where the punning starts to come in, and this is where it starts to get a bit metaphysical in terms of the use of argument. And it does. There's an argument that it falls into that syllogistic pattern as well, as we looked at before. Basically, I spite of your hate means I feel spited by your hate, so I feel hurt by your hate. But I spite of your hate means I feel your hate and I hate you in return. Very aggressive. Without your leave can see, without your permission can see and die, dispense a nobler fate. 'Tis easy to destroy, you may create. Now, it's interesting because what he does is he builds her up to be on this pedestal of courtly love, as we talked about earlier. You know, he does this quite subtly, but he does it first by referencing her beauty. He does it by talking about how the woman's his fate is in her hands in terms of will she love him or not, you know, quite Petrarchan in a way. And also the idea of her dispensing a nobler fate, to give out fate. So only gods can do that, only deities can do that. So will she give him a better fate or a worse fate? And also, 'tis easy to destroy, you may create. Gods are destroyers and creators. Only God can destroy and create. And so he gives her, endows her with all of the qualities of the goddess, which would, in a poem that was traditionally about courtly love, be a way that the woman would be complimented, but it's not here. He's giving her the option. So it seems to be in one sense a takedown or an inversion of courtly love. Let's keep going. Then give me leave to love. So we've got a bit of the second stage comes in. Then give me leave to love and love me too. not with design to raise as love's cursed rebels do, where puling poets whine, famed their beauty from their beloved Ein. Ein is just a weird, archaic, poetic version of eyes, by the way, which is even weirder because he uses eyes later, but Ein just means eyes. He's criticising poets, which is interesting given that he is one, which is one of the many ironies in this poem. He properly goes in, he calls them puling poets, moping around looking sad and pathetic. He really lays into poets. And he calls them love's cursed rebels. He's saying that to write poetry is the opposite of love, actually, and that most poets write terrible poems and don't know what love is at all, which is weird given that he's a poet writing a poem about love in which he's, well, seems more angry than in love. It's very, very odd, this poem. And he says, give me permission to love and love me too, not with design to raise. So he's saying, love me, but don't love me in the way that other people love poets, because women often love poets because they know the poet has the power to write a blazon, to write a woman as being brilliant, right? Don't seduce me just so I'll make you look good as a poet, yeah, because that's nonsense, and I hate poets anyway. And he then talks about if he is a poet and she wants to use him as a poet, then he's got two powers. He has the power to deify her, and he can put her on that pedestal, and he can write about how amazingly hot she is and how goddess-like she is, or he can take her down. He can write about storms in her brow, nets in her hair, and he can use his words as wounds, flames, and darts. So we've got this bellicose imagery, this imagery of fighting and battle, suborning all your parts. So this is the opposite of blazon. So blazon is when you would elevate the woman's parts. Your eyes look like pearls. Remember, the garden in her face? It's terrible. But instead, here, the conceit becomes one of battle and captures. If you look at that penultimate stanza, or torture captive hearts. The idea that she's holding him ransom as a poet, and so all he's got left in his arsenal are his words. And so he says, I'll make your eyes like morning suns appear as mild as fair, if you love me. Your brow is crystal smooth and clear, and your dishevelled hair shall flow like calm region of the air. So he's saying, look, there's bits of you like your dishevelled hair that aren't very good, but I'm going to make it look heavenly. But you got to love me. Which makes that title so weird, because the title is To a Lady That Desired I Would Love Her. Well, if she desires that you love her, why are you having to convince her to love you? It makes no sense. So what we get then, and we've got to bear in mind that Carey was a really, really smart guy. When you first read this poem, it comes across as petty and aggressive and anti-woman, and yet maybe it works as a parody of the blazon and of courtly love in the same way that Shakespeare's poem does. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun, which we looked at before. But maybe it's an extended version of that. The idea that we're so far away now from this courtly love, this Petrarchan tradition, that actually the very idea of writing poems to persuade women to do your bidding is silly. Because if this truly were a poem in which he were threatening a woman to love him, lest he slander her in his poetry, then why would he A, disparage poetry so much, and B, write that in a poem? Why wouldn't he just write a poem disparaging her instead? But he said he didn't, did he? He wrote lots and lots of poems about Celia. Now, this isn't directly at Celia, but this isn't about Celia. But he spent so much time writing about Celia and how much he loved her, and about how their souls were intertwined, and carpe diem and all the rest of it. This doesn't fit with that. So if we think about, does metaphysical poetry modernise or hinder the cause of female equality? It's really complicated. It appears at first, and this is a problem in metaphysical poetry as well, it's very slippery, and because it's quite ludic by its nature, even with poems that don't appear to be ludic, like this poem here, doesn't appear to be ludic, doesn't appear to be playful, and yet as soon as you start looking what it's actually saying, the layers of irony upon irony upon irony upon irony, and it defeats itself at every turn, you've got to wonder whether this is Carey struggling with, or at least trying to work through, how male and female relations were supposed to work. Think about the influence that John Donne had on him as well. It wouldn't make sense that he meant this, completely on the nose. It would make sense that he were being satirical or smart or argumentative, because that's what Donne did. And also, Donne really, really believed in love. Like, Donne really believed in love as the union of souls. He believed that love was metaphysical. And I'm going to talk a bit later on about Neoplatonism and the idea of the one, and the idea that love is the force that unites heavenly things and earthly things. And maybe then, therefore, to a lady that desired I would love her, maybe this is a poem about love that isn't love. Maybe he's saying that if you are a poet and you write about women like this, and if you use poetry to manipulate women, then you're not a poet. But also, if you use poetry to belie women with false compare, to quote Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, you're not a poet either, and you're not a very good man either. Maybe this poem is a satire of attitudes to women. That would be the only way it would really work. And if you think about Donne, and if you think about the way he writes about women, and if you think about his attitude towards his wife, and the influence he had on Carey, seems to be the only way that would make sense. This poem isn't, therefore, the takedown of women that we might have thought that it was. I hope that makes sense, because it's mad. Right, Anne Bradstreet. Now, this picture of Anne Bradstreet was from the 19th century. It's on Wikipedia, actually. I think I got this wrong. There's no portraits that exist in her lifetime. So she would have dressed like this and probably looked nothing like it, except that, that picture looks like no one. She's a local girl, more or less. She's born in Northampton. I sit in Northampton now as I say this. She emigrated to North America, though, which probably is a testament to how terrible Northampton was at the time. She's the first Puritan figure in American literature. We know that Puritans, sick of how liberal England was, quite a few of them went over to the New World and founded colonies. So her family migrated at a time of the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She's described as an educated Englishwoman, a kind, loving wife, a devoted mother, Empress Consort of Massachusetts, a questing Puritan, and a sensitive poet. If you're not sure about what Puritanism is, please have a look at the second appendix of the booklet on ludic poetry I sent out last week. There's a huge appendix in there about what Puritanism is, so I'm not going to go over it again. But it's really important that you know what it is, because it's such an important set of beliefs. For a time, she was well educated. If we think about the rallying cry to educate women that was appearing in the mid-century, it certainly was heard by Anne Bradstreet and her family. But her father, Thomas Dudley, was a steward of the Earl of Lincoln, so it makes sense that she would be educated. You've got to remember that even in the Tudor period, women were being educated. So it's also worth bearing in mind as well that Dudley and Bradstreet's husband Simon were instrumental in the founding of Harvard, one of the most famous and prestigious universities in the world. And she played a large role in the lives of Puritan women. She reflected the Puritan role as a dutiful wife and mother, but she genuinely seemed to love her husband. She wrote poems to him and about him. She loved her children, but Puritans viewed children as being gifts from God. It's also worth remembering that Puritanism is about being abstemious, but within marriage, women and men should be having sex, and they should be being intimate. They only prohibit it when it's outside of marriage. But marriage and the family and children are so important to Puritans. It's about keeping that sacred. And if you think about the idea of the nuclear family that arose in, especially not in 1950s America, it's directly descended from these puritanical beliefs. It's ultimately about being pure. It's about being good. It's making sure you keep your children and society safe, which makes sense that would catch on, given that it was a new society. You wanted to keep yourself safe. You didn't know what was out there. but yeah, as I said, she really loved Simon. She wrote in To My Dear and Loving Husband, if ever two were one, then surely we. This idea of oneness comes up again and again in metaphysical poetry, which is why she's counted within the metaphysicals, because of that Neoplatonic idea that everything was linked by love. More on that later. She wasn't without criticism, though. Some men didn't like women writing stuff. I mean, it's one of the reasons that a lot of female writers, I mean, even J.K. Rowling did it, used male or at least male sounding pseudonyms. You know, think about Mary Ann Evans. No one knows who she is. Well, she's George Eliot, one of the most famous writers of the Victorian era. You know, even the Brontes were known originally as Ellis Currer and Acton Bell, all of which are stupid names that are nowhere near as good as their normal names. But I digress. She didn't, though, Bradstreet, believe that women had to be inferior to men. And she wrote in one of her poems, I forget what it was, but she said, "Now say, have women worth, or have they none? Or had they some, but with our queen is gone? Nay, masculines," about Queen Elizabeth, by the way. "Nay, masculines, you have thus taxed us long, but she, though dead, will vindicate our wrong. Let such as say our sex is void as reason. No, 'tis a slander now, but once was treason." She's basically saying, just because Elizabeth I is dead doesn't mean you can start slagging women off. Because you wouldn't have done it when she was alive, because that would have been treason, because Elizabeth was strong. She really admired Elizabeth I, bemoaned her death, and wrote poetry about how much of a female role model Elizabeth was. And Elizabeth certainly was. Elizabeth was a very powerful, single-minded woman. And so here is Anne Bradstreet's a letter to her husband, absent upon public employment. The context of this is that her husband was often away on official business, being a politician, and is sometimes away for months at a time. He used to travel quite a lot to different parts of America. Remember, the family were setting America up, essentially, around the Massachusetts Bay Area, but also down in other areas in New England, as far as Connecticut as well. And so he was often away, and she was left with children. Which she didn't mind, but she really, really missed her husband. And so this, think of this poem as being really similar to Donne's valediction forbidding mourning. It's almost the female version. Here it goes. "My head, my heart, mine eyes, my life, nay more, my joy, my magazine of earthly store. If two be one, as surely thou and I, how stayest thou there, whilst I at Ipswich lie? So many steps, head from the heart to sever, if but a neck, soon should we be together. I, like the earth this season mourning black, my sun is gone so far in zodiac, whom whilst I joyed, nor storms nor frosts I felt, his warmth such frigid colds did cause to melt. My chilled limbs now numbed life forlorn, return, sweet soul, from Capricorn. In this dead time, alas, what can I more than view these fruits which through thy heat I bore, which sweet contentment yield me for a space, true living pictures of their father's face? O strange effect! Now thou art southward gone, I weary grow, the tedious day so long, but when thou northward to me shalt return, I wish my sun may never set, but burn within the cancer of my glowing breast, the welcome house of him, my dearest guest, wherever ever stay, and go not thence, till nature's sad decree shall call thee hence. Flesh of thy flesh, bone of thy bone, I hear thou there, yet both but one." Really beautiful poem, actually. A real poem of yearning. And again, very similar to Donne's valediction forbidding mourning. And there's a real sense of sorrow. So there's two conceits in this, possibly more. I'm going to talk about two conceits. So there is this idea of the whole human body, and the idea that once you're married and you're yoked to somebody through matrimony, your souls are irrevocably one, which was why you're supposed to stay with the same person forever. And so we get this idea of the unification of souls, and this is really, really similar to the way that Donne presents it. You know, if we are two, we're two, as fixed twin compasses are two. We're actually one. We just look like we're two. And if you bear in mind that this isn't a strange image when you think about Christianity. After all, Christianity goes one better. You've got the triune God. You've got three parts, but one God. And when I talk about Neoplatonism later, it'll make a bit more sense. And it maps the human body to a physical map, and we see the journey he's making. But notice how his journey to Ipswich, which was an area of New England. I forget which state it was in, possibly Connecticut. I'm making it up completely. But she makes it become a cosmic journey. She talks about the zodiac. Now, the zodiac here being the constellations in the sky and how the sun moves through them in its orbit. And when she says "return, sweet soul," from Capricorn, she means that he's away during December and January, and so there's the connotations of being cold and dark, metaphorically as well as literally, and so she feels cold and lost, and the earth is frozen by the fact that her sun, Sol, is not there. And we see this conceit going, I wish my sun may never set, but burn within the cancer of my glowing breast. We're talking about the cancer as in the crab, as in the zodiac. So we're talking about him traveling through the zodiac, through the sky. Notice how she elevates him to that position of sun. She makes him celestial. She puts him on that pedestal. And it's his warmth that needs to happen. Compare this again to The Sun Rising by John Donne for similar use of sun in celestial imagery. But it's a really, really smart conceit. She does also reference children. She references, then view these fruits which through thy heat I bore. Basically, through thy heat, through the sex we had, the fruit of that union, the fruit of our loins, as our children, which sweet contentment yield me for a space. I feel content when I look upon them because they're true living pictures of their father's face. They look like their dad. And so the only solace I've got is when I look at the tiny little sons we made. And that itself is a classical allusion. It's very, very similar to Virgil's Aeneid. Aeneas is about to go off on a big journey, as they always did in epic poems, and Dido protests and says, before you go, at least make me pregnant so I can have a child and I can look at the child so I can see a little Aeneas playing and I won't miss you as much. And so it's a reference to that. And the poem ends on a biblical reference from Genesis, Matthew, and I think Ephesians as well. Flesh of thy flesh, bone of thy bone. I hear thou there, yet both but one. And it's the twin compasses again, isn't it? But the idea that when they're married, their flesh might be separate and their bones might be separate, but they are one. And it goes back to Adam and Eve again, doesn't it? It's an inversion of Adam and Eve because, or at least it plays with the idea of Adam and Eve, but the idea that Eve was made from a removed rib of Adam's. And so man and woman are the same. And that physical sameness is used to represent just how close they are. It's also written in heroic couplets, which means that it's rhymed couplets of iambic pentameter. And it mirrors the way in which epic poetry was written in these heroic couplets, perhaps suggesting that marital love is truly epic in scale and that love will conquer all, and maybe love is the ultimate unifying force. It's a love letter to her husband, but it's also a love letter to the power of love as well, the metaphysical power of love. And if you think about how epic this poem is, it starts with the local, my head, my heart, mine eyes, but then it soon becomes my life. Nay more, my joy, and look at how that becomes metaphysical. We start with the physical body and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And how stayest thou there, what eyes Ipswich lie, but soon we're out of Ipswich and we're traveling through the whole zodiac in the sun. A beautiful poem. In terms of what it says about men and women, what it suggests is that Bradstreet really found within Puritanism a happy marriage. And what metaphysical poetry does do well in terms of gender is it does equalize men and women within the marriage. Now, although it's the husband that goes away and she stays, there is this constant reference in the poem that they complement each other perfectly. And while they're not the same, they are one. And there's a difference. So, for example, she's the earth, he's the sun. But one's not better than the other. They're just different. And in the same way, Bradstreet argues, remember she was very pro woman as well, and she believed that men and women were equal, just different, because equal doesn't mean the same. The earth and the sun are as important as each other, but they do different jobs. And that's Puritanism. Women were respected under Puritanism, it was just that they did different jobs. So while it's not the modern version of men and women can do the same stuff, it certainly doesn't do down women in terms of their intelligence. And what Bradstreet is promoting is that within the family, a man and a woman are each other's intellectual and physical equal. Note that it says that, the view these fruits through which thy heat I bore. I'm the one who bears the children, but I couldn't do it without your heat. In the same way that the earth doesn't work without the sun to warm it, but if the earth's missing, the sun's warming nothing. So they both work together. And that's what we get from Bradstreet. The metaphysical poetry is used in this poem to explore the equality of the relationship between men. Oh, Catherine Phillips. Catherine Phillips is just really sweet, to be honest with you, and sassy as all anything. Catherine Phillips is otherwise known as the matchless Orinda, and I'm going to try and explain exactly what that means. So Catherine Phillips was an incredibly smart woman, just an incredibly smart person. She's highly regarded by many 17th century writers, late 17th century, including Keats and Dryden, thought she was brilliant. She was whip smart, witty, quick, and very, very forward in terms of getting what she wanted. She was a royalist. She was a admirer of the king, a member of the Church of England, which broke with her Presbyterian family's tradition. They were Presbyterian and they were parliamentarians. So she did what she wanted. She was very, very single-minded. If she wanted to change her mind, she did. And she founded this thing called the Society of Friendship in 1651. So right in the middle of the century, right where De Bruyne argues we're starting to see some change. And it was a semi-literary circle made up of mostly women. So they used to do a lot of writing, but it was about friendship, and it was about being there for each other. And it was based on ideas of Neoplatonic love. And its members gave themselves pseudonyms, and they were based on French pastoral romances. So a pastoral romance is a story, an adventure story, basically set in the countryside, and French in this case. And they really loved French pastoral romances. The idea with the pastoral is it's a genre or mode of literature, and it's set in the countryside in nature, but it's an idealized version. And it's idealized because it's about the countryside, but it's for an urban audience, and it's used really to mirror Eden. It's used to mirror it's used to mirror ideas of prelapsarian innocence. Prelapsarian means before the first sin, and so the pastoral in literature is used to represent a state of purity and a removal from society, and it kind of is a precursor for later Romanticism in the 18th century as well, going into the 19th century. And so she really liked, and her little group really liked the pastoral as a mode because it represented this kind of utopia that they wanted to form. It was a utopia in which women could be equal to each other and to men, and that they could share this Neoplatonic love. Now, Neoplatonic love is the idea. Well, Neoplatonism, first of all, it basically means a new form of Platonism. Platonism is the philosophy of Plato. Basically, and it's massive, and I can't go into it all now, but basically the chief belief is the belief of the one. All things in the world are bound together in some way, and the force that binds them all together is love. And so it's very, very much a natural fit for metaphysicality, because it means that all forms of love are one and the same. And if we think about John Donne, and if we think about the physical love of the marriage bed being the same as godly religious love, that makes sense, because love binds everything together. And if love makes everything one, then therefore all types of love must be one. The love of God is the same as the love of the bedroom, which explains George Herbert, and it explains batter my heart, three-person God. But it also explains metaphysical poetry as a whole. It explains all of these conceits that are brought together, from Donne's compasses back to the previous poem, to Bradstreet's analogy of the heavens and the earth and the sun. The idea is that we can compare these things because everything is comparable, because everything is one. And so this Society of Friendship was based on this idea of Neoplatonic love, which is really important in terms of female equality, because if everybody's one, then everybody's equal too, because you can't have things that are the same if they're not equal. So Now, it's further kind of complicated with Catherine Phillips, and there's a bit of controversy here, or at least a bit of speculation. She was particularly close to a woman called Anne Owen, who was known as Lucasia. Catherine Phillips was known as the matchless Orinda. They're both names from French pastoral romances. And she addresses more than half her poems actually to Anne Owen. They're possibly lovers. I'm going to look at her poem to Lucasia and analyse whether or not it's a poem of lesbian love, or whether it's something else. I have my own ideas, which I'll share with you. And so we've got this really modern looking woman so far. She was compared, though, to the more daring / radical writer Aphra Behn. Now, Aphra Behn was far more radical in terms of her gender politics than Catherine Phillips. Catherine Phillips was actually viewed as being an exemplar of the ideal woman writer. She was virtuous, proper and chaste, at least in terms of her writing, at least on the surface. She died really young as well, in her early 30s of smallpox. So it's quite impressive the amount of poetry she managed to pump out and the influence she had, given how highly regarded she was by Keats and Dryden, two real literary heavyweights of the late 17th century. It's quite something that she had the influence that she did. So let's have a look to my excellent Lucasia on our friendship. Really simple poem, actually, so it shouldn't be too difficult to get your head around this. I did not live until this time crowned my felicity, when I could say without a crime, I am not thine, but thee. This carcass breathed and walked and slept, so that the world believed there was a soul the motions kept, but they were all deceived. For as a watch by art is wound to motion such as mine, but never had Orinda found a soul till she found thine, which now inspires, cures and supplies, and guides my darkened breast. For thou art all that I comprise, my joy, my life, my rest. No bridegrooms nor crown conquerors' mirth to mine compared can be. They have but pieces of the earth, I've all the world in thee. Then let our flames still light and shine, and no false fear control, as innocent as our design, immortal as our soul. All right, so there's an argument that this is a poem about two women who are, physically in love with each other. Let's break it down. So, first of all, love equals new life. And the internal rhyme of crime and thine, or at least the half rhyme, does suggest a certain intimacy. But love here is new life. And this is a well-worn poetic trope. I wasn't really alive until I was lucky enough to fall in love. So crowned my felicity. I was crowned with luck, basically, to have met you. And it's really interesting, the language that's used here. I am not thine. I am not yours, but thee, but you. I am not yours. I don't belong to you. I am you. Now, this has a lot in common then with this whole flesh thy flesh, blood thy blood sort of business. And it has a lot in common with the Neoplatonism that we see in John Donne and that we see in the other poets as well. And it certainly seems then that this is a poem that's about a marriage. And if it's not a marriage in the physical church sense, then it's a marriage of minds. And actually, there's a Shakespeare poem that kind of sets this up. Let not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Shakespeare writes in sonnet 16, I can't remember which one it is, 106, there's a lot of sonnets. But Shakespeare writes that love is not love when it alteration finds. It is an ever fixed mark. Basically, when you find the person that you love, it's a marriage of true minds, and it doesn't change, it doesn't falter, it doesn't end, and you become each other. And that's what, within the first 4 lines, Orinda says she has in Lucasia. Now, and it suddenly becomes like the question of whether they were physically like lesbian lovers or not, we're kind of moot because they've got something way bigger. Their souls are the same. To the point where before she met Lucasia, she says she was a carcass, she was a dead body that breathed and walked and slept. Notice the repeated and. It's polysyndeton, which means that it's the repeated use of conjunctions. It slows the line down and gives us a sense of sluggishness. But then we've got the conceit of the watch. But as a watch by art is wound to motion such was mine. So when Orinda finds her Lucasia, time starts. you know. So we've got this reference to this metaphysical reference to time itself. Notice how with all of these poems we start in the physical world, but when we we get in a rocket and shoot up past the firmament and into the stars, because for all these metaphysical poets, the physical, the physical world is but the beginning of human experience. So what we find then, and never had Arinda found a soul till she found thine. I never found a soul until I found yours, and now your soul's mine. And now she is my joy, my life, my rest. There's something about the marriage vows about this, though. And I think one of the arguments for this poem is that actually sex doesn't really matter when you are as in love with somebody as this. No bridegrooms nor crown conquerors mirth to mine compare can be. Basically, it doesn't matter how happy a bride is on his wedding day. A bridegroom, sorry, a groom is on his wedding day, because I'm happier than that. I'm happier than a king that's just conquered a new country. They've just got pieces of the earth. I've all the world in thee. Then let our flames still light and shine. And this is where perhaps there's a slight sexual bit of imagery with the flames. Compare that to the heat of the loins from the earlier poem. As innocent as our design, immortal as our soul. And to the repetition of souls over and over and over again. We see it actually later on, perhaps this is an influence on something like Wuthering Heights, where Cathy says of Heathcliff that their souls are the same. And this comes up again and again in literature. When writers really want to talk about love, they talk about souls. So for me, the question, is this sapphic or is this spiritual? It's definitely more spiritual than it is sapphic. It just strikes me that Arinda's not that bothered about Lucasia's body. She doesn't talk about it. She doesn't talk about her physical body. She talks about her own physical body, but only beforehand. Once she talks about having met Lucasia, the physical body doesn't matter anymore. It's irrelevant. So I think the question, is this poem about lesbian love? Maybe, but I think it's far, far beyond that. Love is a heavenly experience. There seems to perhaps be a desire similar to Astel's religious retirement, that maybe women are better off without men. This was a society mostly comprised of female friendship. There's no real sapphic implications. It's just that women are better off when they're around each other, presumably because of what happens when you ostracize a group for so long. They're inevitably going to turn inward, and they're inevitably going to form their own societies. So, does metaphysical poetry modernise or hinder the cause of female equality? In terms of this poem, it's not really bothered about women being equal to men. It's only really interested in women being equal to each other, and perhaps that's more of a feminist position than the other. This is a poem that's just so unconcerned with men, it doesn't matter. They're not once mentioned, other than actually, to be mocked. Bridegrooms and crown conquerors. I don't care what men have achieved. I've got you, a woman, and I understand you like I understand myself. And maybe there is that union of souls, and maybe it's made more easy because they're both women and they both understand what it's like to be a woman at this time. So, conclusions, as we're really past the hour mark now. Does metaphysical poetry modernise or hinder the cause of female equality? Okay, there's a few bullet points to go through. Overall, female roles are strictly defined, even in the poems written by women. If you look at Bradstreet, we've still got the strictures of marriage, and some modern feminists would criticise the idea of marriage as a form of slavery. Certainly, Bradstreet's got no qualms with that. One of the questions I think that does come up is metaphysical poetry too concerned with wit and flights of fancy to ever deal with gender properly? It's a really big question, and I kind of want to leave that one open to you. What I would say is that for in terms of Arinda and Lucasia, they use their metaphysical poetry to live in a completely different world, a world of wit and flights of fancy, and they're not really bothered about gender. They seem to be beyond that. Bradstreet seems to fully embrace her gender, but is and seems to have found an equilibrium. Seems to be really, really quite happy with the marriage she has. Is the Neoplatonism so inherent in metaphysical poetry a hindrance to real change? Perhaps no, because anything that promotes the idea of oneness promotes equality. And we do have a foundation for modern feminism. Bradstreet and Phillips were greatly admired. You know, they were criticised, but what writer isn't? Phillips in particular inspired other female writers, and you know, founding a society of female writers at the time is a big deal. And we see women communicating as equals. And there was certainly a great deal of hope. If we look at Astle, for example, we've got women leading the charge. You know, in 1792, we get Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, and things get better. So maybe this is part of a process, a line between these poems and the female writers of today. Perhaps, you know, we have metaphysical poetry accidentally promoting or giving rise to the ideas of equality. You know, this Neoplatonic idea of the one just has to promote equality by its nature. So to conclude, does metaphysical poetry modernise or hinder the cause of female equality? It seems that, if we're going to put it really, really briefly, that on one hand, it's not really that bothered, because it seems to suggest that we're far beyond such simple earthly questions. And I ended with Phillips because she promotes the idea, almost a post-gender idea, a post-sex, post-gender idea, where she's purely concerned with that metaphysical connection between souls. And so maybe metaphysical poetry is way ahead of its time. And I mean way ahead of its time, in terms of predicting a post-gender, post-class structure, where the only thing that matters is that unification of souls that goes beyond thought, beyond time, and beyond space.